Good morning, girls. In the last lecture of J2EE, we learned the include directive and forward directive action tags of JSPs, right? Two types of action tags in JSPs we already learnt in the last lecture. We had gone through some more action tags which we can use in JSP. They are JSP use bean, JSP set property, JSP get property, JSP plugin, JSP param, and JSP fallback. As you know that JSP forward tag, this action tag is used to forward the request to another resource. It may be JSP, HTML, or any other type of resource where you can forward your control, right? Here you can see the syntax of forward tag. JSP forward, these are the keywords. We have to mention one attribute, that is page attribute. This is mandatory attribute. You can specify its value by providing a URL of a page where you want to move your control. With parameters, our syntax is look like this. As you can see on the screen, we enclose the parameter tag in between the forward tag of starting and ending, right? Provide the relative URL for page attribute, enclose the parameter JSP parameter action tag between forward tag. Here we will provide two attributes, namely name and value. Name means you have to provide the name of parameter which you want to initialize, right? And the value means the value that you want to assign to the newly created parameter, that we can specify with the second attribute value. It may be in the form of constant or it may be in the form of expression. You can specify the value of parameter in this two different ways. Either you can specify a value or you can specify even expression, right? We had gone through the example of forward action tag. Then we also learned include action tag. This action tag is used to include the content of another resource. The type of resource you can use over here, it may be of type JSP, HTML, or servlet. The JSP include action tag includes the resource at request time, so it is better for dynamic pages, right? You can even use include directive in JSP. We had gone through the difference between these two also. If you want to include your static page in your current JSP page, at that time you can use include directive. And if your page is dynamic, right, if your page contains some dynamic content, for that you can use include action tag. These are the main difference. Advantage of JSP include is you can reuse the code whatever defined previously, right? We can use a page many times, such as including header and footer pages in all other pages. So it saves our lot of time for making it more and more time. Fine. So it is better you use include action tag. Here you can see the syntax of JSP include action tag without parameter and with parameter, which is very similar to JSP forward. Here you can observe the one change only, that is the keyword. Instead of forward we will use include, right? All other attributes are same as forward action tag. As you can see, page attribute is defined for JSP include, and we have to provide a relative URL or we have to provide an expression for page. if you want to if you want to define any parameter for your JSP page, then you can enclose JSP parameter tag in between JSP include tag. Again, here you have to provide two attributes for JSP param, namely name and value. Name means the name of parameter you can assign in this attribute, and value means value for that particular parameter you can assign in this attribute, or else even you can define an expression for this attribute. We should enclose parameter tag in between the include tag. We had gone through the example of JSP include in the last lecture, right? Now today we are going to discuss about the scope of JSP objects. As you can see on the screen, the availability of a JSP objects for use from a particular place of the application is defined as the scope of that JSP object. Every object created in a JSP page will have a scope. Object scope in JSP is segregated into 4 different parts, and they are page, request, session and application. I repeat the meaning of scope of JSP object. The availability of a JSP object, whatever object you are defining in your JSP page for use from a particular place of your application, is defined as a scope of that JSP object. Whatever objects you are defining in your JSP page will have a scope, right? Here you can see the 4 different types of scope of JSP objects are available. They are page, request, session and application. Let us begin with the first one, that is page. Here the page scope means the JSP object can be accessed only from within the same page where it was created. The default scope for JSP objects created using JSP useBean tag is page. Yet we have not learned this term, right? Later on we will cover this term, useBean, and with the help of this tag you can define an object. An object defined with the help of this tag, its scope is by default page. JSP implicit objects like out, exception, response, page context, config and page have a page scope. These all implicit objects we have already learned in previous session somewhere, right? So all of you are very well aware of these objects, implicit objects. I repeat, the objects which are implicit in JSP, namely out, exception, response, page context, config and page. These all implicit objects have a scope page only, right? The second one is request. A request object in JSP, a JSP object created using the request scope can be accessed from any pages that serves that request. More than one page can serve a single request. As the client send his or her request to the server, right? At that time we can create a request object. The JSP object will be bound to the request object. Implicit object request has the request scope. Second is session. Session scope means the JSP object is accessible from pages that belong to the same session from where it was created. The JSP object that is created using the session scope is bound to the session object. Implicit object session has the session scope. As you know that we have one default object named session. Its scope is also session, right? That object is implicit. It creates itself by the JSP. I repeat, session scope means the JSP object is accessible from pages that belong to the same session from where it was created. The fourth one and the last one is application scope. A JSP object created using the application scope can be accessed from any pages across your whole application. The JSP object is bound to the application object. Implicit object application has the application scope. As you know that one of the implicit object is application, and the scope of that object is application scope that work throughout your application, the pages across your application. So these are all different scopes available in JSP: page, request, session and application. Now a second topic of today's session is session tracking in JSP. The session tracking in servlet we have already learned in the previous session, right? Here as we have done session tracking in servlet, same way we can do the session tracking in JSP also. We'll discuss the session tracking in JSP. Here we have to clear one concept, that is HTTP. HTTP is a stateless protocol, which means each time a client retrieves a web page, the client opens a separate connection to the web server. I repeat, HTTP is a stateless protocol. Stateless means each time a client retrieves a web page, the client opens a separate connection to the web server, and the server automatically does not keep any record of previous client request. Okay, maintaining session between web client and server. Let us now discuss a few options to maintain this session between the web client and web server. As we have discussed that every time it creates a new separate connection for the web server, we can keep the track of the server, right, which is sent by the web client. So how we can do this? Let us learn with the help of cookies, with the help of hidden form field, with the help of URL rewriting, and with the help of session object. These are the 4 ways we can maintain the track of session that we have already studied in the previous chapter, previous unit, servlet, right? Once again, let us go through the same concept. First one is cookie. With the help of cookie, you can maintain the session tracking between the web client and web server. A web server can assign a unique session ID in the form of cookie to each web client, and for subsequent request from the client, they can be recognized by this ID using the received cookie. I repeat, a web server can assign a unique session ID by itself as a cookie in the form of cookie to each web client. The client which is sending a request, right, web server assign one unique session ID for that client. For maintaining this subsequent request from the client, they can be recognized using this received cookie. If the value of cookie is same, it may be it is considered as it is coming from the same client. This may not be an effective way, as the browser at times does not support a cookie. If someone in the sense, if the client inactive the cookie for their browser, it is not a proper way or effective way, we can say, as the browser at times does not support a cookie. It is not recommended to use this procedure to maintain the session, right? The second way is hidden form field. In this way of session tracking, web server can send a hidden HTML form along with a unique session ID. I repeat, a web server can send a hidden HTML form field along with a unique session ID. As you can see the syntax, input type equals to hidden, then second attribute name is defined, and value for this hidden variable is also defined. This entry means that when the form is submitted, the specified name and value are automatically included in the get or post method, in the get or post data. Each time the web server sends a request back, the session ID value can be used to keep the track of different web browser. They can keep the track with the help of the session ID defined for this hidden field, right, and track with the help of the value assigned to this session ID. This can be an effective way of keeping track of the session, but clicking on a regular hypertext link does not result in a form submission. So hidden form field can also it cannot support general session tracking way, right? This is not the proper way. The third way is URL rewriting. You can append some extra data at the end of each URL. This data identifies the session. The server can associate that session identifier with the data it has stored about that session. For example, here you can see the address is given http:/abc.com file.htm, where we have assigned one value, session ID value, with the name session ID equals to 12345. The session identifier is attached as session ID 12345, which can be accessed at the web server to identify that particular client. Whenever the client sends this request, he or she attach the same session ID for her browser or his browser, and the web server identify that particular client with the same session ID and same session ID value. URL rewriting is a better way to maintain sessions and works for the browser when they don't support cookies. The drawback of this method is that you will have to generate every URL dynamically to assign a session ID through page is a simple static HTML page. So this is a main drawback of URL rewriting, that you have to generate every URL dynamically to assign a session ID, right? The fourth way is the session object. Apart from the above mentioned methods, JSP makes use of the servlet provided HTTP session interface that we have already learned in our previous unit, right? This interface provides a way to identify a user across a page, a one-page request, or visit to a website, or store information about that user. See, this is the proper way we can say that, because it identify a user across the page request, whatever or how many requests the user is sending. The session identifier can recognize throughout the page request, visit to a website, or even it can store information about that particular user. By default, JSP have a session tracking enabled, and a new HTTP session object is instantiated for each new client automatically. See, here you have to keep this thing in your mind. By default, JSP have a session tracking enabled. By default, this JSP have session tracking enabled, and a new HTTP session object is instantiated for each new client automatically. Disabling session track requires explicitly turning it off, right? We have to give a command if we want to explicitly turning off this attribute, right? Disabling session track requires explicitly turning it off by setting the page directive session. Here you can see the syntax, how we can set the session ID false. Page directive is used for keeping the session value off explicitly, right? By default, it is always remain on true. The JSP engine exposes the HTTP session object to the JSP author through the implicit session object. Since session object is already provided to the JSP programmer, the programmer can immediately begin storing and retrieving data from the object without any initialization or get session. This is the method to get the value of the session, right? We will see the methods we can use with JSP for accessing the session value or for destroying the session values, right? Important methods available through the session object. Here these methods are. See, we just started the discussion about the methods, and these methods are shown on the screen. They are get attribute, set attribute, get attribute names, get creation time, get ID, get last access time, is new, remove attribute, and invalidate. These are the methods available for accessing the session values, right? With the help of session object you can access it. The first one is public object get attribute, and as a parameter you have to pass the name of string, right? You can send the string name as a parameter. This method returns the object bound with the specified name in this session. See, this method will return a object bound with the specified name. Here whatever name you are passing, the object bounded with this name will be sent you to back, or null if no object is bounded under the name. If nothing is assigned for this name, then you will get null as a result. The second method is set attribute. Here we have to pass two parameters, string name and object value. This will set the value for an attribute with this name, and the value is we can mention as a second parameter which we want to assign for this name. This method binds an object to the session using the name specified, right? This will return nothing. As you can see here, the data type is void, so this will return nothing. If you remember, we have already studied this method for servlet also, right? Get attribute, set attribute. Even the example we will cover for this this chapter, this topic will be the same. So two methods, first one is get attribute and set attribute, one for setting a value for the specified string name, and if we want to get that name, get that value for the same name, you can use get attribute method. This will return object, and here this method set attribute will return nothing to you, right? In this case, if something is assigned to the specified string name, then you will get the object name assigned for the value assigned for this name, and if nothing is assigned for this value, then you will get null. You will get null as a result. Next method is enumeration get attribute names. This method returns an enumeration of string objects containing the names of all the objects bound to this session. We have already learned enumeration in our Java subject, right? This will return a string object containing the names of all objects which is bounded with the session, right? All the session you will get in the object of enumeration type. Here you can see the return data type of this method, enumeration. This method do not have any parameter, right? Because it will access all the names, all the attribute names and assign to the object of type enumeration. Next method is public long get creation time. The method name is get creation time. It has no parameter, but this method will return a data of type long, right? This method returns the time when this session was created. Whatever session you are using for your JSP, the time when the session was created for that particular JSP will be returned by this method. The time will be measured in milliseconds. It will be measured in milliseconds. Keep this question for 1 mark in your mind, right? It will be measured in milliseconds since midnight January 1, 1970. I repeat, it will be measured in milliseconds since midnight January 1st, 1970. See, these are the questions you can keep in your mind for 1 mark questions like this method return object bound with the specified name in the session, or null if the object is bound under the name, right? Then second is the get attribute names method always return an enumeration of string objects. Then third 1 mark question may be this method return the time when the session was created and it is measured in millisecond. Okay, next method is get ID method, which has again no parameters. This will return a type, a string. Whatever it will return, the data type of that thing is value. This method return a string containing the unique identifier assigned to the session. A string contain the unique identifier assigned for this session, right? Then one more method is there, public long get last access time. Get last access time, as the name suggests, this method will return you the last access time for a particular session, right? It returns the last time the client sent a request associated with the current session, as the number of milliseconds since midnight January 1, 1970 GMT. GMT means Greenwich Mean Time. I repeat, this method will return the last time the client sent a request associated with the same session in the form of number which is in which will be in milliseconds since midnight January 1, 1970. Is new method. This method returns true if the client does not yet know about the session or if the client chooses not to join the session. I repeat, this method will return a boolean value, either true or false, when the client sent a request for the first time. Then this method will return a true, right? In case if the client sent a request for the second time, third time, fourth time, then isNew method will return a boolean value false. If the client does not yet know about the session or if the client chooses not to join the session, in that case this method will return true. One more method is there, remove attribute, public void remove attribute. It has one parameter of type string. This method removes the object bound with the specified name from this session. Whatever name you are specifying over here, right, the object bound with that name will be removed by this method. This method will return nothing. As you can see here, return data type is void. I repeat, this method removes the object bounded with the specified name from this session, right? It removes it. The next method is public void invalidate method. This method invalidates the session and unbinds any objects bound to it. Whatever objects you have defined, you have bind with any object, this method will invalidate the session, right? Your session will be invalidated by this method. This method also return void and it does not have any parameter. So we learned many methods for session, right? Session related methods are get attribute, set attribute, get attribute names, get creation time, get id, get last access time, is new, remove attribute, and invalidate. It may be possible in exams they will ask you for explain any 5 methods of JSP session for session tracking in JSP, right? You can select any 5 from the given list. These all methods are very easy, as we have already used these methods in our servlet also. We will also use this method in our JSP coding in our next session, right? So let us revise what we have done today, what we have covered in today's session. We begin with the scope of JSP objects. We learned about the JSP scope of JSP objects. It is segregated into 4 different parts, and they are page, request, session, and application. The scope of page is only for that particular page. The object you are defining for the particular page will be accessed inside that page only. Then second is request. Here JSP object created using the request scope can be accessed from any pages that serve the request. Then third one is session. Session scope means the JSP object is accessible from the pages that belong to the same session from where it was created. And the fourth one is application. This covers the scope. It can be accessed from any pages across your whole application, right? Then we have also covered the session tracking method in JSP, which is able to maintain the session between web client and server, right? The different pages are cookies, hidden form field, URL rewriting, and the fourth one was the session object. These 4 types we learnt in today's session. In detail we will also learn cookies. Today we have started what is a session object, right? This method we are learning. This is continue. Apart from these methods, JSP make a use of servlet provided HTTP interface that we can use for tracking our session. By default, the HTTP session objects instantiated for each new client automatically. You can explicitly turn it off by giving this syntax in your JSP page using page directive, right? You can make it false. You can get or initialize the value of your session through get session method. Okay. Some important methods related to session object are, as we have already discussed all these methods, so will not repeat it. Fine. In the next session we will cover the same topic and we will use all these methods in our example, right? Till then, take care and thank you.